Okay, so we're going to solve number 3 from chapter 6 hard questions. So number 3 tells us to refer to scenario. The scenario reads, let the supply and demand curve for gallons of gasoline be the following. P equals 2Q and P equals 12 minus Q. Treat each question as independent of each other. Question 3 asks, suppose a subsidy of $3 is applied in this market. Which of the following outcomes would result? Q equals 5 and consumers pay $10 per gallon. Q equals 5 and revenue per gallon is $10. Q equals 3 and consumers pay $6 per gallon. Or Q equals 3 and revenue per gallon is $6. Okay. Okay, so we're given a supply and demand curve. So supply is equal to 2Q. And 12 minus Q. And we're told that a subsidy is being applied to the market, and the size of the subsidy is $3. Okay, and so now we want to know how this affects the economy or the market for gasoline. Okay, so to visualize this, let's draw some supply and demand curves. This is demand. This is supply. Here's demand. Okay. So subsidy is essentially the opposite of a tax. So when we think of taxes, we think, okay, this is an increase in cost. Either it's an increase in cost for the consumer when they're buying, or it's an increase in production costs for the firm when they're producing to sell. A subsidy is the opposite. A subsidy is, instead of the government charging you some money, the government gives you some money. Right? And so if we think about it in terms of consumers or demand, right? Instead of the government saying, well, you bought this item, so we're going to charge you $3. The government says, wow, you bought this item, we're going to give you $3 for that item. And so instead of just increasing the cost, it actually decreases the cost or increases the value of the item. So if the item was worth whatever this amount is here, right? Now it's worth $3 more. And so if the item becomes more valuable, right, consumers are going to demand it more. So that should cause an increase in the demand curve. And this can, this can be given, analogously for supply, right? If the government subsidizes production by $3 or by whatever, now the cost of production has gone down. And we know from chapter 4, from supply and demand, that when the cost of production drops, supply increases or shifts down and to the right. So we can do either one of these, right? Again, notice this is not much different from taxes, except we're just doing it to the right of the equilibrium instead of to the left of the equilibrium. Okay. So to solve the question, let's clean up this graph, right? And so we'll reapply the supply curve, the demand curve. The subsidy is $3. And so let's visualize this like we would with taxes. All right, so this is demand, this is supply. Okay, so we can do something similar to taxes, right? We can use what's called the wedge method to get our final result, right? And so what you'll essentially do, instead of doing it on the left side of the equilibrium curve, we'll do it on the right side of the equilibrium curve, right? To represent the increase in value or the decrease in cost, right? And so the roles of the values on the price axis change, right? So before, for taxes, the firms would end up receiving less than was the original equilibrium price, and consumers would have to pay more than what was the original equilibrium price. That changes now. Now, the value up here is revenue per unit firms. And down here, this is what consumers pay. Right? And then over here, this is quantity after subsidy. Right? So the techniques don't change very much. The only thing that changes is now, instead of making the wedge to the left of the equilibrium, we make it to the right. And notice that the quantity increases from the original equilibrium quantity, right? And now, instead of consumers paying more after the tax, they pay less after the subsidy. And instead of firms receiving less after the tax, they receive more after the subsidy, which makes sense, right? The subsidies increasing value for consumers, decreasing cost for firms. Now, again, we can't really use this wedge method when we're solving with equations, right? It's great for a graph that gives us numbers and everything, but we don't have that here. So an easier method will be what we had just said prior, which is let's shift the demand curve. All right, so we shift the demand curve up and to the right, right? Again, to indicate this increase in value due to the subsidy. So this is after subsidy demand. Right? Okay. So now what we do is we find where do we intersect with the supply curve and the after tax or after subsidy demand. And that's here, this point. And what does that give us? Revenue per unit for firms and the quantity after the subsidy. And then subtract the $3 from the revenue, which makes sense, right? If this is what the consumer pays the firm, which is what the firm receives per unit, then the government's going to give the consumer the subsidy, or in this case, the $3. And so what the consumer actually ends up paying is down here, right? So let's do it. So to shift the demand curve up, So here's our demand curve. To shift this curve up 3 units, according to algebra, we just add 3 to the demand curve. So this is after subsidy demand. This is supply demand. That's a subsidy. Now we want to find the intersection point, right? So we set the after subsidy demand equals supply. So we do a little algebra. 12 plus 3 is 15 minus Q. And we'll set this equal to supply, which is 2Q. Again, we'll do some algebra, add the Q to the other side. That'll give us 3Q. And divide by 3 on both sides. We find that Q is equal to 5. So this would be the quantity after subsidy. Q equals 5. Now you can plug this into either the supply, the after subsidy demand, or supply. And so you'll either get 15 minus 5, which is 10, or 2 times 5, which is 10. And so price will equal 10. And this is revenue per unit. And as we said already, that gives us this point here. If we subtract 3 from that, we'll get what consumers pay. Right? So the price that the consumers pay, PC, is equal to what they pay the firm, which is $10, minus the subsidy received from the government, which is 3, which gives us $7. And this is consumers pay. All right, so if we look at the answers, it cannot be C or D, right? Because we got that Q is equal to 5, not 3. So we can eliminate C and D. Answer A tells us that the consumers pay $10 per gallon, but that can't be because we found that the consumers pay $7. So the answer here is B. Q equals 5, quantity after subsidy, and revenue per gallon is $10, which is here.